He fined me $500 for a fence stain I couldn't even control, then smirked as if my humiliation was his morning coffee. That was the moment I stopped being his victim and started planning his downfall. He thought he was untouchable, the king of our quiet suburban streets, but behind his smug grin and those HOA meeting notes, I uncovered a web of fraud so thick it nearly strangled our entire neighborhood. And when I was done, his crown was nothing more than a scrap of paper in the county courthouse. Before I tell you exactly how I brought down a corrupt HOA president without breaking a single law, hit that like button and subscribe. This isn't just a story about revenge, it's proof that patience, strategy, and a little bit of courage can topple even the pettiest tyrant. I moved into my suburban neighborhood with a simple dream of quiet evenings and friendly neighbors, the kind of place where kids ride bikes and sprinklers hiss in the twilight. Instead, I stepped straight into a petty dictatorship. At the center of it all stood Todd, the HOA president, a man who loved power more than air. His smile carried the smug certainty of someone who believed the rules existed only for others. The first time I met Todd, he was already barking orders at a landscaper whose only crime was trimming the hedges unevenly. His voice carried across the cul-de-sac like a bullhorn, every syllable sharpened with condescension. I introduced myself politely, expecting a handshake and a neighborly welcome. He barely looked at me, offered a limp nod, and returned to chastising the worker for failing to meet community standards. My stomach tightened. It didn't take long for me to understand why the neighbors called him King Todd. Behind closed doors, he enforced rules like a dictator. Trash cans had to be pulled in by 9 a.m. sharp or face a $200 fine. Christmas lights down by January 2nd or pay another. But the irony, Todd's own yard was a chaotic mess. An unpermitted shed leaned drunkenly behind his house, and his fence loomed higher than the city allowed. Hypocrisy was his favorite sport. For a while, I told myself to keep my head down. I worked long hours and cherished my free evenings. I wasn't about to waste energy fighting an overzealous HOA president, but Todd had a way of finding people's nerves and plucking them like a guitar string. One morning, I found a bright yellow notice on my door, a $500 fine for using a slightly different stain on my fence, because the approved one was out of stock. I walked to Todd's house, notice in hand, ready to explain. The sun glared off his oversized sunglasses as he stood on his porch, coffee steaming in a mug that read BOF. I showed him my receipts, explained the shortage, and asked for leniency. He sipped his coffee slowly and gave a thin, wolfish smile. Rules are rules, he said, turning away before I could respond. The door clicked shut like a judge's gavel. That single, dismissive smirk burned through me long after I walked home. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while the quiet hum of my refrigerator seemed louder than usual. I replayed his words, the way his lips barely curved, the gleam in his eyes. Something inside me shifted, a cold, deliberate certainty settling in my chest. Todd had underestimated me, and I would make him regret it. The next morning, I stared at my coffee cup and decided my revenge wouldn't be loud. It would be meticulous, legal, and devastating. Screaming in the street would only feed his ego. I wanted something cleaner, something that would leave him standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. But first, I needed to know how his kingdom worked. At the next HOA meeting, I volunteered to join the board. Todd's eyes flickered with surprise, then amusement. He mistook my calm smile for submission. "Great," he said, patting my shoulder as if knighting me into his little empire. "We need more people who care about the community." Inside, I nearly laughed. He had no idea what kind of care I planned to bring. The first months were a study in silence. I attended every meeting, pen poised, absorbing his methods like a student of tyranny. Todd ruled through paperwork, burying board members in documents until they simply gave up. He scheduled votes when only his allies were present, and any homeowner complaints seemed to vanish into a black hole of lost paperwork. Neighbors whispered their frustrations after meetings, their voices low like conspirators. I filed a request for a new mailbox 2 years ago. One woman confided, "Never heard back." Another shook his head. He fined me for a cracked driveway, but his own is worse. Each story was another thread in the tapestry of resentment. Todd thought he was untouchable, but I saw the cracks forming. Over time, I learned the rhythms of his control. He bullied timid board members into silence, leaning across the table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When someone dared to push back, he'd drown them in obscure bylaw citations, his voice dripping with feigned patience. I took notes, every tactic, every weakness. My plan was simple: outlast him, then dismantle his empire from within. But fate has a way of accelerating plans. One chilly autumn evening, while sorting HOA paperwork, I noticed something odd. The budget numbers didn't add up. We collected far more in annual fees than our crumbling common areas suggested. The pool had been under maintenance for half the summer. The landscaping looked abandoned, yet our fees were higher than comparable neighborhoods. I asked Todd about the discrepancy during a board meeting. He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scraping the sidewalk. "Don't worry," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I've got it under control." My gut tightened. His casual deflection was more than arrogance, it was fear disguised as confidence. I filed a formal request for the financial records, citing our own HOA by. Todd's smile faltered for just a moment, a micro-expression that betrayed unease. "Sure," he said, regaining his composure. "I'll get those to you when I can." Weeks passed. Nothing arrived. Meanwhile, I began knocking on neighbors' doors, gathering stories like a journalist hunting a scandal. Over a dozen homeowners admitted they'd tried to access the budget over the years. All were ignored. One neighbor whispered that Todd had installed a lavish new patio recently. Rumor had it, using HOA funds. Another claimed Todd's children swam in the pool during its mysterious closures. Each testimony fed the quiet fire inside me. My mission was no longer just personal. It was justice for every family Todd had manipulated. But if he was stealing, I needed proof. Real, irrefutable proof. And to get it, I would have to be patient, precise, and ready for the storm that would follow. As winter deepened, I watched Todd strut through the neighborhood with the false confidence of a man who thinks his secrets are buried deep. But I had already started digging, and I was nowhere near finished. Snow glazed the rooftops by early January, and every time I passed Todd's house, I felt that subtle tug of unease sharpen into determination. His windows glowed warm in the winter dusk, a smug beacon of unearned comfort. I'd filed my request for the HOA's financial records weeks ago, yet my mailbox remained empty except for grocery flyers and utility bills. The silence wasn't neglect, it was strategy. Todd thought delay would make me give up. At the next board meeting, I sat across from him and waited for the right moment. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and pine-scented cleaner as neighbors shuffled papers and cleared throats. When I calmly asked about the records, Todd offered the same rehearsed grin. "Still working on it," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Some files went missing. You know how it is." He gave a conspiratorial wink that made my stomach knot with disgust. That night I tossed in bed, every creak of my house sounding like Todd's laugh. I imagined him counting stolen dollars while I stared at the ceiling. My mind spiraled. Was I overreacting? Was I chasing shadows? But then I remembered the $500 fine for a fence stain I couldn't control, the pool that sat closed while children pressed their faces to the chain-link fence, the neighbors who whispered their suspicions. No, I wasn't imagining anything. He had crossed a line and I would not retreat. Days turned into weeks of quiet frustration. Todd continued his petty reign, issuing new citations with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. One neighbor was fined for a basketball hoop slightly visible from the street. Another received a warning for leaving a holiday wreath up past January 5th. I watched these small injustices pile up like kindling, each spark fueling the fire beneath my calm exterior. I knew I needed allies, but trust in our neighborhood was brittle. People feared retaliation, worried that Todd would double their fines or bury them in legal threats. So I started small, over cups of coffee and quiet backyard chats. I shared my growing concerns, not the full picture, just enough to draw out their own stories. To my relief, they came pouring out. Mysterious charges on HOA dues, vague administrative fees, and Todd's sudden purchase of a brand new riding mower that never seemed to leave his backyard. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. I needed the actual numbers, and Todd guarded them like treasure. I sought advice from a neighbor who worked as a paralegal. She leaned in, her breath visible in the cold night as we spoke in her driveway. "By law, he has to show you the records," she said firmly. "If he doesn't, you can escalate. But be careful, people like him don't back down quietly." Her warning echoed in my mind as I filed a second formal request. This time, with certified mail so he couldn't claim ignorance. When another 2 weeks passed without response, I sent a final notice citing the HOA's own bylaws and the state statutes he was violating. The next board meeting felt electric, every seat filled, neighbors curious about the tension they sensed but couldn't name. When I asked again for the records, Todd's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat, then forced a laugh. "Patience," he said, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "These things take time." I held his gaze until he looked away. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. It was small, but it was enough to keep me going. Winter thawed into a muddy March, and with it came an anonymous envelope slipped beneath my door. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of a bank statement with our HOA's name at the top, and a series of questionable withdrawals. The sender left no note, only a faint scent of cigarette smoke clinging to the paper. My pulse quickened as I traced the numbers, thousands withdrawn in cash, all signed off by Todd. Someone else in the shadows wanted him exposed. The discovery set my nerves humming. I stared at that sheet long into the night, the digits swimming in the lamplight. I knew this wasn't enough to bring him down, but it was the first undeniable crack in his armor. Who had sent it? A board member, a neighbor tired of his tyranny. Whoever it was, I silently thanked them and slid the paper into a folder labeled Todd that I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Encouraged, I widened my quiet investigation. I cross-referenced the numbers with every scrap of public record I could find: county property filings, contractor invoices, and archived HOA minutes. The deeper I dug, the stranger it became. A $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company with no business license, thousands listed under administrative costs with no explanation. My gut told me what my mind hesitated to accept: Todd was stealing from us, and not even trying hard to cover his tracks. Yet, the more evidence I gathered, the more the pressure grew. I found myself waking at 3 a.m., heart pounding, every shadow in my room a threat. What if Todd suspected me? What if he retaliated? My phone buzzed late one evening with an unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped, then checked the voicemails. Only silence, but it left a cold trail down my spine. Spring arrived, and Todd's behavior grew more erratic. He snapped at board members during meetings, his jokes brittle and forced. He sent out an email announcing a temporary increase in HOA dues to cover unexpected costs, a move that sent neighbors into quiet fury. I could feel the tide shifting. People were angry, and for the first time, their eyes turned to me for answers. One rainy night, as water streaked the window pane, I reviewed my growing dossier: bank statements, photos of Todd's extravagant backyard renovations, testimonies from neighbors, and the mysterious envelope. The folder was thick now, heavy in my lap. My hands trembled not with fear, but with the gravity of what I was about to do. I knew I couldn't act alone. I called an impromptu gathering of trusted neighbors, inviting them into my living room, where the scent of coffee and damp coats filled the air. I laid out the evidence piece by piece. Gasps and whispers rose as the picture came into focus. Todd wasn't just a bully, he was a thief. Faces hardened with collective resolve. We would not be silent. Still, we agreed to move carefully. Todd's grip on the board was strong, and a premature confrontation could give him time to bury his tracks. We planned quietly, each of us with a task: gathering more testimonies, compiling financial records, and preparing for the annual HOA meeting. As the night ended, a quiet determination settled over the room. Days later, Todd cornered me in the parking lot after a meeting, his eyes sharp beneath the fading sunlight. "You've been busy," he said, his tone half accusation, half threat. My heart thudded, but I met his gaze evenly. "Just doing my job," I replied. He lingered for a beat, searching my face, then turned abruptly and walked away. His retreat felt like both a warning and a confirmation. He knew something was coming. From that moment, every encounter with Todd carried a current of unspoken tension. Neighbors felt it too. Conversations hushed when he passed. The neighborhood itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm. The annual HOA meeting loomed like a gathering thundercloud. I could almost hear the distant rumble in the quiet evenings as I walked the streets, rehearsing what I would say when the moment came. The evidence was ready. The neighbors were restless, and Todd's carefully built empire of fear was about to meet a force he never expected: the quiet, relentless power of a community united against him. The night of the annual HOA meeting, the air itself seemed charged, as if the spring storm that had rumbled all day was waiting to break until the first word was spoken. Neighbors arrived in a slow, steady stream, faces tight, voices low. The community hall smelled of damp earth and freshly brewed coffee. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum floor, each metallic squeal a small reminder of the tension humming beneath the surface. I sat near the front, the thick folder of evidence heavy across my lap. Inside, every document, every email, every photograph that proved what we all suspected. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. This was the tremor of a bowstring drawn tight. Todd entered late, as if he owned time itself. His khaki blazer was perfectly pressed, and that familiar smug half-smile played at the corner of his mouth. He carried no binder, no papers, just the casual confidence of a man who believed his authority unshakable. "Let's keep this quick," he said with a chuckle as he reached the podium. "I'm sure everyone wants to get home before the next downpour." A few polite laughs trickled through the room, but most people stayed silent. The storm outside grumbled, the agenda droned on budget updates, landscaping plans, minor maintenance issues until we reached the final item. Financial review and new dues assessment. Todd cleared his throat. "Given the unexpected costs this past year, we'll need to increase monthly dues by 20%. The room erupted in a low murmur of discontent. That was my cue. I stood. "Before we talk about raising dues," I said, my voice steady, "we need to review the association's financial records, as required by our bylaws." Todd's smile faltered for the briefest flicker of a second. "We've already covered that." "No," I cut in, louder now. "We haven't. I've submitted 3 formal requests for those records. The law requires they be produced, yet we've seen nothing." The room went still. Todd straightened, his voice tightening. "If you have concerns, you can schedule a private. This is the time," I said, and laid the folder on the table with a heavy thud. Every head turned. One by one, I drew out the documents. Bank statements showing unexplained cash withdrawals. Landscaping invoice for $15,000 paid to a company that does not exist. Photographs of the brand new riding mower hidden behind Todd's fence. Gasps cut through the room. Todd's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is private information," he stammered. "You have no right. It's public HOA documentation," I replied, holding his gaze. "Every homeowner here has a right to see it." A neighbor in the back spoke up. "So, that's why dues keep going up." Another voice joined. "We paid for that mower, didn't we?" The murmurs swelled into a low roar of outrage. Todd's composure cracked. He rapped the podium with his knuckles. "This is slander." "I will not." "You signed the checks," I interrupted, sliding forward the anonymous bank statement. The signature, unmistakably his. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, briefly bleaching the room in white. The storm outside finally broke, rain hammering the roof, as if the sky itself were delivering judgment. Neighbors rose from their chairs, their voices firm now. "United, we want an independent audit, effective immediately, and vote to remove the president." The words came not as a shout but as a title. Surgeon Unstoppable. Todd backed away from the podium, eyes darting for an ally and finding none. Even his usual supporters avoided his gaze. The secretary, pale but resolute, called for a motion. Hands shot up across the room, everyone except Todd's. It was over in minutes. The gavel struck once. Motion carried. Todd Mitchell is hereby removed as HOA president pending full audit. A collective exhale swept the hall. The storm outside raged, but inside, the tension drained like water through a cracked dam. Todd stood frozen, the weight of silence heavier than any accusation. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out into the downpour, the door banging shut behind him. Neighbors gathered around me, voices overlapping. Thanks, relief, plans for next steps, but I only nodded, the adrenaline fading into a quiet, almost solemn calm. Justice wasn't the rush of triumph I'd imagined. It was steadier, like a house finally settling onto its proper foundation after years of slow, hidden rot. As the meeting adjourned, I stepped outside into the rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something cleaner, freer. Todd's porch light was off when I passed his house later that night. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to all of us again. I didn't look back. The storm had washed the street clean. Morning sunlight spilled across the neighborhood the next day, golden and almost theatrical, as if the world itself wanted to underline what had happened. Birds sang louder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way now that the tension had cracked. The streets, washed by last night's storm, gleamed with a fresh brightness I hadn't noticed in years. For the first time since moving here, I walked my dog without the dull weight of Todd's petty dictatorship pressing on my chest. Freedom had a scent, clean rain mixed with cut grass and quiet triumph. But the story wasn't finished. Removing Todd from the board was only the beginning. What we uncovered next would ripple through every home in the subdivision. Within 48 hours, the board, now led by our level-headed secretary Marissa, voted to bring in an independent forensic auditor. We wanted proof, cold, hard, undeniable numbers. The accountant we hired was a sharp-eyed retired CPA named Florence, a woman whose gray bun and steel-rimmed glasses gave her the air of someone who'd spent decades catching cheats. She carried a leather briefcase, like it held secrets the world wasn't ready to know. Florence dove into the records with the hunger of a detective who had waited her whole life for this case. I watched her work for hours at the community center, papers spread across the table like pieces of a complicated puzzle. The rhythmic scratch of her pen became the soundtrack of our quiet war. He didn't even try to hide it well, she murmured one evening, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping. This is theft, plain and simple. Her words carried the weight of a gavel, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. 2 weeks later, Florence presented her findings at a special homeowner meeting. The room filled again, this time with a buzz that was part anticipation, part outrage. Her report was brutal. Todd had siphoned over $50,000 from our dues into personal accounts. He had forged invoices from a phantom landscaping company and inflated maintenance costs to hide his withdrawals. He had even paid a crony contractor, his old drinking buddy, for repairs that were never performed. Every fraudulent transaction was neatly documented, signatures matched, and timelines aligned. Gasps and murmurs rippled across the crowd as Florence flipped each page. People who had once rolled their eyes at my suspicions now stared at me with something like respect. He robbed us, Marissa said, her voice tight. All of us. The betrayal stung deeper as neighbors realized that every pool closure, every scraggly hedge, every crumbling sidewalk had been a direct result of Todd's greed. The community had suffered while he quietly built his personal slush fund. I could almost feel the collective hurt in the room turn into a harder, sharper resolve. We voted unanimously to press charges and pursue a civil suit for restitution. The police investigator assigned to the case, a patient man named Lieutenant Harris, listened carefully as Florence handed over every document. He looked up from the folder and nodded. "This is airtight," he said simply. "He won't wriggle out of this." His confidence carried a finality that made my heart race with a quiet thrill. After years of silent frustration, the wheels of justice were finally turning, and this time, Todd couldn't hide behind bylaws or smirks. Word of the scandal spread beyond our little neighborhood like wildfire. Local reporters caught wind, and soon our quiet subdivision found itself on the evening news. HOA president accused of embezzlement. The headline blew. Cars slowed as they passed Todd's house. Neighbors whispered on their porches, and even children sensed the shift in the air. Todd had once wielded fear like a weapon, but now the only thing surrounding him was an invisible fence of shame. His carefully polished image of control and authority had cracked beyond repair. I'd see him occasionally in those days out by his driveway, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to avoid contact. The confident stride was gone. Each step seemed weighed down by invisible chains. Sometimes I almost felt a flicker of pity, but it faded quickly. I remembered the sleepless nights he had caused, the fines he had imposed without mercy, the way he had laughed when I pleaded for leniency. Justice wasn't cruelty, it was balance being restored, and Todd was finally feeling the gravity of every petty rule he had once thrown at us. When the civil suit and criminal charges were officially filed, Todd's life unraveled faster than anyone expected. His so-called contractor, buddy cornered by investigators, turned on him within days, trading testimony for leniency. Bank records matched every accusation. Todd's lawyer, a weary man with thinning hair, could do little more than negotiate the inevitable. By the time the first hearing arrived, Todd's reputation was not just tarnished, it was scorched earth. Even the few neighbors who once called him a friend now crossed the street to avoid him. The judge ordered him to repay every cent plus penalties. To cover the restitution and his mounting legal fees, Todd was forced to put his house on the market. The for sale sign stood like a silent monument to hubris in his front yard. For months, I watched potential buyers stroll through the open house, whispering about the scandal that had made headlines. Some came just to see the infamous property of the disgraced president. Todd's once pristine lawn grew patchy and brown, as if even the grass had lost its will to cooperate. When the moving truck finally arrived, the neighborhood watched from behind curtains and half-closed blinds. Todd loaded boxes with a mechanical slump, his once careful posture now bent and tired. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. Children whispered and giggled, their parents trying not to stare. A man who had thrived on attention now fled it, reduced to a shadow of the tyrant who once ruled every HOA meeting with a smug grin. As the truck pulled away, a breeze rattled the for sale sign until it toppled onto the dead grass dot. In the months that followed, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. With Todd gone, the board worked together like a team finally freed from a long siege. We set term limits and required that all major expenditures be approved by at least 3 members. We created a digital portal where every homeowner could view budgets and meeting minutes in real time. The first thing we funded was the community pool, repainted, and open all summer. Laughter returned to the water like an old friend who had finally come home. Landscaping crews trimmed every neglected hedge and replanted flower beds that had withered under Todd's rule. Sidewalks were power washed, streetlights replaced. For the first time in years, the neighborhood looked like the one I had imagined when I moved, in vibrant, welcoming, alive. HOA dues even dropped slightly once the bleeding of funds stopped. Each small change felt like a collective exhale, a visible sign that we had taken back what was ours. The sense of community we rebuilt wasn't just about property values, it was about dignity reclaimed. One evening, as I strolled past the house that once belonged to Todd, I noticed a young family moving into little girls, chasing each other across the yard while their parents carried boxes inside. Their laughter rang through the evening air, pure and unburdened. The sight made me smile in a way that surprised me. The house that had once symbolized corruption and arrogance now pulsed with life again, as if the neighborhood itself had decided to heal. Todd's shadow had finally lifted, replaced by the bright, chaotic energy of new beginnings. Months later, over coffee with Marissa, I learned that Todd had tried to join another HOA board in the neighboring town. She laughed as she relayed the story. Someone had simply typed his name into Google, and the search results told the rest. He was laughed out of the room before he could even make his pitch. Justice, it seemed, had a long memory and an even longer reach. His reputation was a scar he couldn't hide, a quiet warning to anyone else who might dream of using power for personal gain. I often think back to the night of the storm, the crack of thunder, when the truth finally broke open. That moment lives in me like a lesson carved in stone. Revenge hadn't been about fury or spectacle. It had been about patience, about letting truth gather weight until it became undeniable. There was a deep, almost sacred satisfaction in knowing that justice, once slow and heavy, had landed exactly where it belonged. And that satisfaction has never faded. Some nights, when the street is quiet and the pool lights glow in the distance, I sit on my porch and listen. The neighborhood hums with the gentle sounds of normal life, dogs barking, sprinklers hissing, children giggling as fireflies blink across the lawns. It's the sound of balance restored. I breathe it in and let it settle deep, a quiet victory song only I can hear. I never set out to be a hero. I was just a neighbor tired of being pushed around. But when people like Todd overreach, when they twist authority into a personal empire, someone has to stand up. I did, and it mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone who calls this place home. Our community didn't just survive Todd's reign, it grew stronger because we faced it together. That is the real revenge, a neighborhood united, thriving in the very space he once tried to control. Justice wasn't loud, it was steady. It wasn't vengeful, it was righteous. And every time I walk these clean, quiet streets, I feel the truth of it. Todd's name has become a punchline, a cautionary tale, while the rest of us lived the life he tried to exploit. That, more than any courtroom victory or news headline, is the sweetest ending of all. As dusk settles and porch lights flicker on, one by one, I lean back in my chair, letting the warm evening air wrap around me. The fight is over. The neighborhood is whole, and somewhere out I close my eyes and listen to the soft chorus of my peaceful street. This is what winning feels like, not a shout, but a long, quiet exhale after years of holding your breath. The kind of victory that needs no applause, because the proof is all around you. In every lighted window and every shared smile, we took back our home. And that, in the end, is the purest form of revenge.